If we stay on the road we're on, we face radical changes to our physical world. This is what the vast majority of climate scientists tell us.
The alarm bells keep ringing. Our citizens keep marching. We cannot pretend we do not hear them. We know what we have to do to avoid irreparable harm. We have to cut carbon pollution in our own countries to prevent the worst effects of climate change.
Since our government started meeting in 1990 to come up with a plan to reduce emissions, global emissions have gone up by 61%.
Ireland is a small country, yes, but we have a large carbon footprint.
Ireland is far off track, the transition it needs to make in terms of emission reductions.
The commitments of individual states are way off course for a safe world.
Our political leaders are sleepwalking us into a crisis of epic proportions, and they're playing political poker with the future of this planet.
We're talking about allowing sea levels to rise in the name of protecting an economic system that is failing the vast majority of the people on this planet with or without climate change.
We need to change the conversation that we're having with ourselves and one another about the future, because the roadmap that we've laid out at the moment is a road to disaster.
We are at the moment on track more towards 5 or more degrees of global warming, or at least 4. And 4 degrees of temperature change on a global average is almost as big as the difference between the temperature between now and the last ice age. It would be a massive disruption of human civilization.
I have friends who are like, oh, I love global warming. Well, they don't mean it, but you know, some people don't really care. They don't see the badness.
I mean, you hear stories about the ice caps melting and you know, sea levels rising and temperature and climates changing. It does worry you a little bit, but then you hear these arguments about like that this always has been going on.
We humans have never experienced a hot period on Earth. We've already put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through human actions, 40% over the pre-industrial level, than have been in the atmosphere in the last 3 million years. Now, 3 million years ago, when there was that much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, global sea levels were 20 meters higher than they are today. It was a different world.
On the science side, it is absolutely clear now. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that assesses all the global science on climate change and synthesises it into a summary for governments, said in 2014 that it's 95% certain that the rising temperatures that we're seeing is caused by human activity. And that's the same level of certainty that we have around smoking causing cancer.
We now know enough about carbon to say how much is too much. In fact, they said any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. That's very strong language for scientists to use. Stronger still when you know that wherever you are today, you know, Vancouver, Vienna, Vietnam, the atmosphere is 393 parts per million CO2 and growing about 2 parts per million per year. So already way too high. That's why, you know, Texas burns and Pakistan drowns.
We're already seeing the impacts of shifting rainfall, increased number of disasters on people's lives and livelihoods.
We've already experienced colossal impacts, but many people, because we mostly live in towns, we live in cities, we live indoors, are maybe unaware of the extent to which the natural world is already under assault. The WWF recently published what's called the Living Planet Index for 2014, and that showed an extraordinary decline in vertebrate life. It's down by 52% in 40 years. The pH of the oceans have risen by, I think it's about 30% since the 1950s. If that continues as projected by mid-century, we may have a situation where we have a cascading collapse of complex life in the oceans. What does that mean? That means marine life as we understand it dies. We're left essentially with an ocean full of jellyfish. We depend on the ocean for huge amounts of our oxygen. A dead ocean will lead to a global die-off that will extend far beyond the oceans. It'll certainly extend and take out most of life on Earth.
I think there is a shift, and I think people are thinking about it a bit more, and I suppose realising that it's going to affect their lives in different ways, and it's not going to just be about a positive warmer day or a warmer summer, that there will be significant threats to people in Ireland.
We're seeing impacts of climate change now, I would say, reflected in the response of the physical environment through flooding, through loss of biodiversity.
I mean, you'd speak to people like Professor John Sweeney in Maynooth. I mean, he's fairly clear about what the impacts will be, and I mean, we've already seen them, I think.
We know that Ireland is going to become wetter in the winter, so flood frequencies will increase very significantly. We know that Ireland will become drier in the summer.
We have new storm and flooding maps that have been created for Northern Ireland by the Rivers Agency, and they're very good. But they show that already central Belfast is under significant risk from flooding, and that's without adding on climate change projections.
Most civilizations developed in the coastal regions for the obvious reason of principally of trade. So all our great cities, whether it's Dublin, New York, etc., they're all located along the coast. And we have trillions worth of infrastructure within a couple of metres of the sea level. Now, if we get sea level rises as projected by the IPCC by mid-century to late century, we're looking at 1, 2, and in some cases several metres of sea level rise. That means we're going to lose this infrastructure. For example, the world's ports by definition are at sea level. The world's ports are the vessels of trade globally. We can't trade without functioning ports.
Ireland is quite vulnerable in many areas to coastal erosion. And coastal erosion, of course, is something that will be enhanced as sea level rises, because wave energy will be increased as waves fall from a greater height. And also we expect storms to be more extreme and more intense on a warmer ocean in the years ahead.
When I was a kid, I was even aware of, reading about growing up on the coast that the water levels are rising, and you're always kind of terrified of the drowning of cities and things. But I mean, I don't know how far away that is, or if it's avoidable in any way,
In February 2002, this part of Dublin had a water level rise of just under 3 metres with the storm surge, 2.95 centimetres. Now, therefore, we have to we have to recognise that wasn't a once-off occasion. It's not going to be something that will never ever happen again.
That's a major issue in Belfast. We've had houses flooded, property damaged.
You take a metre of sea level rise, it doesn't sound like a lot. You amplify that with a 2 to 3 metre storm surge, and suddenly you've got areas that, like Clontarf in Dublin, like Sandymount in Dublin, many parts of Cork and Waterford cities, they're going to be underwater. We had a major fodder crisis in Ireland, which is almost unprecedented in the last 2 years. We've had 2 huge freeze events. Now, freeze events are counterintuitive, but they're to do with the disruption of the polar vortex because of the rapid rate of Arctic ice melt and loss. So, paradoxically, climate change and global warming to this part of northwestern Europe can also bring severe freezes.
The last few winters have been so cold, and it's boiling now, and this never really happens. So it's not just coincidence. Definitely something is going on.
A loss of predictability. This is one of the key things, particularly in agriculture. For example, if you get a spring of drought, you can have an entire year's harvest badly affected. Equally, if you get floods at harvest time, you can have an otherwise good year ruined. So agriculture, and we're still quite an agricultural country, is highly exposed by definition to climate change.
Time is pressing, the window is closing. We can't let this problem be put on the long finger. We can't let it be left for the next generation to solve. We have to actually tackle it seriously in a way we're not doing at the moment.
It's around a lot, so you hear a lot about it, but to be honest, it doesn't really affect me that much, so I don't really give it much thought.
The first thing I think of is polar bears, and then after that I think that probably I should think about it more, but there's so much going on that I don't really think about it at all, to be honest.
So for Irish people to say, oh, it's something that's happening in Africa, or it's something that won't affect Ireland, I think is a rather insular mentality. We will become, ultimately, we will change our climate according to the global average. We are a mid-latitude country. We will get the average change of the rest of the world. So if it warms up by 4 degrees, we will warm up by 4 degrees.
Ireland's overall contribution to climate change may look small relative to other countries. When you break it down to a per person contribution, each person in Ireland emits nearly 10 tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. That's more than 100 times the average person in Uganda. And when you compare it to other large countries like India or China, it's still significantly more.
Our emissions remain high per capita. If everyone in the world polluted like the Irish, we'd need 3 planets to survive. Or maybe it's dropped to 2.5 now because of the recession, but it's still 1.5 planets more than we've got. So therefore we're going to have to do our bit to get down to 1 planet living.
If you think of the sort of person who Trócaire works with on the ground as a small-scale family farmer, a small plot of land, maybe a few livestock, they're on the edge of poverty, on the edge of survival. And there's a lot that they do to maintain their livelihood, but climate change is bringing in an additional stressor on an already vulnerable situation.
We've seen how climate change or erratic weather has really affected food security in Africa. If I look at my own country, Kenya, and then we look at the diversity of the climate change issues that we are facing, on the eastern side of the country, we're faced with constant drought. But if you look at the western side of the country, particularly close to Lake Victoria, it's continuous flooding. And so when you talk to all the farmers, particularly those that are older, they will tell you, 30 years ago, this was the growing season. But now it is changing, and we can no longer tell when it is time to plant, and we can also no longer tell what the quantity or quality of our yield is going to be.
ኣየር ፀባዩ ብጣዕሚ ጽቡቕ ነይሩ ዝናብ እውን ይዘንም ነይሩ ዝናብ ይዘንም ብጣዕሚ ጽቡቕ ኻሊኣት ነይሩ ንገንዘብ ዝበሃል ችግር ሳዕረ ይነበረ ካብ ጊዜ ናብ ጊዜ ግን በሐቅና ተለወጠ ደረቅ ኮይኑ ማይ ዝበሃል ዳርጋ አብዩ ለብዘበን ቁርበ ብተወሰነ ያውም ለብዘበን እውን ኣብቲ ዝወቅዕሉ ነበረ ይጀመረን ሰነይ ወቃን ሐምለይ 11 መዓልቲ ጀመሩና ካብኡ ጀመረ ቁርብ ወቂዑ ቁርብ ቆጽሊ ተርእዮ ኣሎ
ኣብ ኣየርላንድ ዘለውና ሕና ኒኤናን ይፈላለዩ ሕዚ ኣየርላንድ ዘሎ ብኢንዱስትሪታት ክኸውን ይኽእል ሕና ኒኤናን ብዝምቑራፅ ኣግራብና ግራባዳ ብምንጣይ ሕዚ ኣብ ኣየርላንድ ዘሎ ካብ ኢንዱስትሪታትና ካብ ተሽከርከርቲ ዝወፅእ ጋዝ ንምባል በን ዝኾነ ንዕኡ ዝኾነ ጋዝስ ምፍጣት
بتكجل أو سجمت رخيبي يبهر دام بعد أنسس حدقو تكيت جوارو أنا سلطة فاتنا زلة سجم قداس سلطة سحنا زلة حدقو ملكو.
We're seeing people in Africa depend on agriculture, but we're seeing they are no longer able to farm because they do not know when the rain season is coming. So it's making life very difficult. People's incomes are reducing to more than half. So we're seeing the impacts and the effects of climate change.
Don't be a fossil fuel! Don't be a fossil fuel!
Here they want to have a new mandate to do nothing until 2020. We need deep cuts of emissions now. Every year 350,000 persons die because of climate change.
Do you think is climate change something that's affecting the world at all? Do you think?
I think so, but then there's a lot of people who say that it's not real and that it's just made up.
The lobby to try and tell us that there is no climate change is very powerful, and even though there's a lot of consensus, there's still so much of the media is saturated by people saying that it doesn't exist, and they have a lot more money than the people who don't.
There's too much money getting made. It's as simple as that, and they're greedy, so they don't want to lose their money.
What has happened is that the fossil fuel industry has been loud enough in its threats and promises, in its use of its resources, and it is the most by far profitable business that human beings have ever engaged in. It's been able to use that money and the power that it gives to drown out the warnings of scientists all over the world.
Much has been spoken about denial, say through the likes of the Fox News and the many of the right-wing denial, formal denial. But the most powerful denial is the denial in you and me. The denial that sort of says, yeah, it'll probably be all right, and this has never happened before, and you know, change is normal and we'll be fine. That denial, that little voice in your head.
I think it's a very natural human reaction that we don't want this to be true. We don't want climate change to be a human responsibility because it involves taking on actions that might seem inconvenient. We just rather it wasn't true.
We've been told we're entitled. We should have more of this, more of that, more of the other. The science and common sense tells us that we're running out of this, that and the other. We're running out of world.
Human beings, I guess, tend to be greedy, and we're not going to value the environment if we don't value what it does for us. And we need to understand how much it does for us. We need to understand that the economy is based in the environment.
We're pushing other species to extinction. Many of these are what are called keystone species. We depend upon them, not just for their welfare, but for our own welfare.
Economic growth relies on the environment, and if we disregard the environment in any way, we're sort of biting the hand that feeds us.
It's a system that we constructed, that we do well by, that without intending to, is in the process of destroying life on Earth. That's a hard thing to get your head around, because that system has delivered us, you know, central heating, flushing toilets, the iPhone 6, all the good stuff in life, foreign travel, things that our grandparents couldn't have dreamed of. And yet the same system that has delivered so many goods is also in the process of destroying us.
There's been a report in 2014 by the corporate leaders on climate change in Ireland, so a group of progressive companies including Vodafone and Diageo who are progressive on this issue, and they've said actually the government shouldn't be worried all the time about the cost of action on climate change because there's real business opportunities.
There's an obvious benefit to the private sector who are going to get involved in this because it will actually pay them to do it. You know, Vodafone have talked about the same thing. They said that they want this kind of direction. You kind of just wonder at what point do companies have to keep saying it and people have to keep saying it before government actually start to listen. Because if it was anything else, I mean, if it was another kind of incentive, or if it was kind of a tax break, or if it was some kind of thing to get businesses going and create employment, government will bend over backwards to do it.
What we need is the incentives and the decisions from policymakers to kind of give the green light to this.
Some countries have been very proactive. Some countries have taken very marked initiatives, even small countries. The best example I can think of at the moment is Scotland, where a very ambitious greenhouse gas reduction figure of, I think, around 45% is targeted. That country is well on the way to achieving it. There's a very enlightened climate change law in the United Kingdom, where climate change has been taken out of politics. Alas, we haven't managed to do that in Ireland, and we still have the problem of vested interest groups and lobby groups influencing decision makers to a high degree for short-term gain.
When I talk to world leaders very passionately, Secretary General, don't worry, I'm supporting you, and I'll always do what you say. But if I want to help you, I need to be re-elected. So let me be re-elected first, then I'll come back to you.
We have politicians, for the most part, who look to the next election. They're not looking 10 years down the road. Now, the current crop, at least, there's enough of them that are young enough, that have long careers ahead of them. And maybe they're the ones that should be driving this and saying, look, Again, give me 2 terms, give me another term, and we'd start doing this, and maybe then you might start to get the changes and kind of bring people on board with them.
I definitely think there's more that governments could be doing. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but I don't think that it's in the news or it's as high on the agenda as it should be, because to me it's a real pressing problem.
It's such an urgent problem, and it's not really being, we're not acknowledging it or addressing it in the right way.
Our generation and the generation of the political system at the moment, they will be viewed incredibly negatively if this is seen as something that they knew about, they had the means to act. It's been shown that acting now rather than later is actually more cost effective, because the longer we leave it, the harder it gets. If we have the knowledge, the means, like, why didn't we act?
You know, the job of government is to lead. The job of government is to come up with these policies. I mean, they have endless advisors, they have an entire civil service at their disposal. There's very smart people across that sector that I've no doubt have very good ideas in this area. But because it's not a priority of the minister, and because ministers are so busy doing lots and lots of different things, you're not getting that kind of clear direction.
The government has set a challenging but achievable target for agriculture. They've acknowledged that it's a sector of particular importance to Ireland, and they've said most of the actual cuts in emissions will happen in transport and energy and buildings, but that agriculture and land use should aim to be carbon neutral by 2050.
Our global energy is principally hydrocarbons, coal, peat, lignite, natural gas, etc., shale gas. These are disastrous. Burning, extracting, polluting all over the world, absolutely disastrous.
I can only afford to have gas and electric. I can't really afford to have alternatives like solar power or, you know, and I don't have access to things like wind energy. So, I mean, that's a problem for people, is the expense. And the government isn't really doing anything for us to give us legitimate options.
So we definitely need a switch away from fossil-based economy and a move towards more sustainable approaches in everything we do, in transport, in our energy use, in our food production. You know, it comes into so many different angles of our lives.
We think that the government should set a target of being fossil fuel free in totally by 2050, and fossil fuel free for energy production, for electricity production and for buildings by 2040, because Ireland actually has a huge natural advantage here. We have very, very good renewable energy resources. Support for renewable energy in Ireland is really high when measured by public opinion surveys. Despite the fact there has been a rise in protests around wind energy in the intervening period,
there's been an awful lot of wind companies going into areas and saying, you know, this is my plan for 10 turbines or 20 or whatever the case may be, and they're being kind of giving communities an upgrade of the local GA club or jerseys for the under 12s, or really small benefits.
I think the real game changer is giving people a stake in the energy itself, in the production itself. And we've seen some really good examples of that in Ireland. In Templederry and Tipperary, there's a community-owned wind farm, and the community is getting huge payback from that and a sense of ownership.
All the revenue generated stays within the community. And this is huge, because from the community's point of view, our small wind farm has the same benefit as if an outside developer were coming in and building maybe 30, 40 turbines, because they would only be leaving maybe 3.5–4% of the total revenues in the area, and the rest would be exported out to their investors.
You might think, surely we don't have enough solar energy in Ireland, but actually we do. It's daylight you need. We have good daylight, we have good sun during many months of the year. We already see that in people getting hot water from solar panels from like May to October.
We're not getting the kind of behavioural change and the impetus for that behavioural change from government. I mean, we still have a huge difficulty. I mean, with cars, the number of cars on the roads are right back to boom time levels. You know, ministers are still coming out and they're saying we're not going to introduce demand management like congestion charges or anything like that, because the public transport system isn't up to scratch. We've heard this argument of the public transport system not being up to scratch for a decade now at this stage. We've had massive investment across the board. There's way more private companies out there than previously were. So how come government isn't saying, we've spent an awful lot of money on this expensive infrastructure, you need to use it, A, because it's a value for money issue, but B, you need to use it because climate change is a real issue, and one thing that we can do very quickly is reduce a lot of those emissions if people just leave the car at home, get the bike or get the train.
We've seen a real growth during the recession in people cycling. We need to kind of reinforce that now as the recovery kicks hold. It's time for a congestion charge in Dublin. And we also need to see investment in our trains as well around the country.
If you look at the success of the retrofit scheme in houses, where you look at what 250,000 homes have been, improved, more energy efficient, that's obviously reducing fossil fuel imports. If you look at that and you actually look at the response of government to that energy situation across the public sector, there's not a whole lot of work being done in that area. Big things like hospitals, prisons aren't up to best practice. That's an easy one. I mean, you get the finance, you do it, you get the payback very quickly.
What we would always be calling for is that people take action in terms of political action. And that's one of the biggest things they can do in their individual lives, is to talk to their local TDs, talk to their public representatives, let them know that this is an issue that they care about.
We've had a battered society where really it has been, bed down and get on as best you can. And there hasn't really been room, I think, for that kind of debate. But now we seem to be turning a corner.
There's a feeling that there's this momentum building in the climate movement, and more people are getting involved, and more people from less traditional sort of environmental backgrounds, people who are concerned about lots of different issues, are sort of coming together and recognising that climate change is a threat to all of the things that they stand for.
I think Ireland can and should take a strong position in terms of a political response to climate change. What does that mean in practical terms? That means strong, binding climate legislation and every minister being put in charge of dramatically reducing our carbon intensity. We are a small, globalised country. We sink or swim with the rest of the world. Therefore, we must, apart from putting our own house in order, which is an essential first step, we must also use all our diplomatic, all our commercial, all our political influence on the world stage, and it is significant, to encourage, cajole and badger others, larger countries, to also step up. But in order to do that, you lead by example, you lead from the front, and we can do that in Ireland.